Hello, I'm Caroline Marshall, and welcome to Bump to Business Owner, the podcast speaking to mums in business, you. I'll be in conversation with some of the most inspiring women and mothers in enterprise about their journey, how they created their successful businesses alongside raising their children, and what that looks like in work and family life. Hello and welcome to today's episode of Bump to Business Owner. I'm your host, Caroline Marshall, and today I am joined by the incredible Dr Claire Ashely, GP, NHS clinical entrepreneur, content creator, author of The Burnout Doctor, and mum of two. Claire's work is shaping how we think about burnout, especially for those of us balancing motherhood, business, and burnout recovery. With over 20 years of clinical experience and a powerful personal journey through anxiety and burnout, she now dedicates her career to helping others understand, prevent, and recover from burnout. Claire's insights are grounded in science, but also personal. We'll be diving into what burnout really looks like for mothers, founders, and women, and why recovery is longer and more layered than we think, and how to start having honest conversations about trauma, rest, and resilience. This is a conversation that challenges toxic productivity and highlights a different, more compassionate path to sustainable success. Claire, I am so excited, or should I say Dr. Claire, because honestly, I feel like this is the podcast I needed almost 7 years ago, let's say 7 years ago, when I had my burnout episode while pregnant with my first. So I'm sure lots of personal stuff will come in for both of us, because I think it's such an important topic to talk about, and a misunderstood one, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Caroline, thank you so much for inviting me onto this podcast and for allowing me to share my journey for your audience. I know from my own personal experience of that kind of complex interplay between motherhood and career and entrepreneurship that really primes people for burnout. So it's such an important conversation to be having for this particular group of people.
So Claire, you're a doctor, GP, you've also had a clinical entrepreneur, speaker and author. So your work with burnout is really deeply personal. Tell us a bit about your journey through that and how it led you to who you are today versus who you were before your burnout experience.
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, it's so interesting there that you said about, that burnout journey and how I ended up being a completely different person, because honestly, when I was in the thick of it, I did not recognize who I was or what I had become, because I was so far removed from the person that I'd known for the best part of, I think I was 36 when it happened to me, right? I knew who I was and I was very happy and comfortable in who I was, but it took me just 6 short months to go from being that person to being someone that was in a complete crisis, suffering with total loss of confidence. And it was absolutely devastating to be in that position and just not recognize who I was. I was so caught up in what I was experiencing that I completely lost my identity. I also lost a lot of other things, including, a lot of joy in my life. And I look back at that time and I feel so sad about the joy that I lost, not just with my career, but also with my family and my children, who were very young at the time. And, that recovery journey has been very long, but I have finally come out the other side. And for me, one of the biggest things that I realized in that recovery journey was when I felt like myself again. And it took a very long time, so much longer than I thought it might. And it's taken a lot of changes to be able to get myself there, but I am there now. And one of the biggest things that for me on my journey recovery was when my husband said to me, the woman I married is back. And for me, that was just such a wonderful moment, because, 6 years ago when this all kicked off, it had taken just 6 short months for me to go from being happy and fully functional to having developed crippling anxiety alongside severe depression. I was experiencing a whole myriad of symptoms, including horrific nightmares and the most awful intrusive thoughts. I couldn't control these thoughts. They just popped into my head at any moment and were largely centered around harm coming to my children. So they were really distressing and I really felt them in the moment, I was self-neglecting. So I wasn't looking after myself properly. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't exercising, but I was still going to work and I was still showing up for other people, despite the fact that I wasn't really looking after myself. I couldn't control my emotions. I either found myself flying off the handle or in tears over the smallest of things. I wasn't sleeping. I was always tired. My head was a mess. It was an utterly exhausting place to exist. And the crunch point for me came when I started having panic attacks. And up until this point, I'd been really well. I'd sailed through medical school, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly competitive and stressful. I'd sailed through my postgraduate training, which, 10 years of postgraduate training, it's a long slog, during which I had 2 children as well.
So I had 2 babies.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And after my first, I went back to work full time as well. And, I was working long days in medicine, doing on calls, doing night shifts. So that was tough, but I coped and it was fine. So I thought I knew how to manage my stress. And so I didn't quite understand how I'd unraveled so quickly. And I was experiencing severe burnout, but at the time, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it had a name. Actually, our time frames are very similar, actually, Caroline, because yours was about 7 years ago, mine was about 6 years ago
Yeah,
now.
and also I realised, I think because I was pregnant at the time, there was so much I blamed on pregnancy, but the
Mm,
6 months time frame, even though I obviously got pregnant in that, so it all got merged, which it can, but the 6 month time frame I'm really relating to that. I went from one person to 6 months later, I was completely different.
yeah, so there are so many parallels, aren't there, between our
Yeah.
journeys, which I hadn't realised actually.
Yeah.
And looking back, it was terrifying to think that it took such a short period of time. But this is the thing about burnout. And actually, I think we're going to come on to talk about the stages of burnout and the things that you might miss when you're starting to feel really stressed that enable you to make changes before you end up in full blown burnout. But at the time, I had no idea what was happening, and I didn't know what I needed to do to get better as well. And the irony of being a doctor with a degree in neuroscience and all of these years of clinical experience is not lost on me. I didn't know or understand what was happening to me. The word burnout was not in my vocabulary. It had never been mentioned during my training in any way, shape, or form. And so if you have a doctor
With
with all of this,
neuroscience.
yeah,
Wow.
exactly. And if you have someone who has been through all of that training and doesn't know what's happening to them, like how can we expect other people to know either, let
Mm.
alone take effective steps to either prevent it or to recover from it? And so on my recovery journey, I kind of, I learned so much about what it really means to effectively prevent and recover from burnout. I did a massive deep dive into the scientific literature because I'm a massive scientific geek. I love reading medical evidence. I loved medical school because I got to properly geek out on all of this sort of stuff. And I really found that what I was discovering wasn't really out there in the public domain. And so I started sharing a little bit about what was happening to me on social media, because also this was complicated by the fact that COVID happened just as I left the job that had burnt me out, with a plan to kind of locum and take some time to think about what I needed to do to recover. And then all of that just went out the window because I had to work full time during the pandemic, and it was a very difficult time. But also we lost the ability to use our physical support networks, right? Because we weren't allowed to meet up with people. And so I went online. I was
Mm.
very isolated. I was also very angry about what had happened to me, having dedicated all of these years of my life to medical training and to patient care. I just was a bit bewildered really about how I'd ended up there. And in sharing my journey, so many people were coming to me saying, Claire, I feel the same. I thought I was the only one. And I was like, right, so let's go in on this. It wasn't my intention to end up writing a book on burnout, but, I had so much positive feedback that what I was sharing was helpful for other people that I was like, okay, I really want to leverage what I've got here and to grow my social media presence around burnout. And so that's kind of ended up how I ended up writing the book. Really was I grew that presence on social media, and then other people started to be interested in what I was talking about, and then that led to quite a lot of career changes. Writing the book, ended up kind of doing a lot of work in the corporate space as well, doing talks on corporate well-being. And my career now is very different to how I imagined it. But, it all started off with what was the worst period of my professional and personal life. But now I'm in a much better place, both professionally and personally, I would say. And so it's been a difficult journey, but I am very, very pleased in a way that it's happened because I'm much happier now as a result.
I think if you get through those difficult journeys, it sounds so cliche, but you do come out more resilient. And you are, while you're back to Claire, you're changed as well. And wow, what a journey. There's so many things to pull from that, like the anger, the lack of community. I know so many of us will relate to that, especially reflecting at we're now 5 years on from COVID. I think there's still people in the thick of not recovering from that and would have experienced burnout. I love how you had someone who's experienced it, the intensity of burnout, because I think when you're someone else looking in, you can't get it. And something I want to ask you, because you clearly like so successful, and I always say this, like when I had my PTSD after almost losing my second child, I think I was so highly functioning it was hard to get help, because it's like you just appear that all the time. And do you think that was your kind of person? And you mentioned work, was it work? Obviously, if you read your book, and there's so many other factors to burnout, but was it work that was the trigger for you? Because I think it definitely was for me, and then it impacted every area of life and made me isolated and made me that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, fundamentally, it was about the job that I was doing at the time, which was the pressures were very different to the pressures that I'd experienced previously. And I was in a very vulnerable place professionally, actually, because I was transitioning from a training post. I don't know how much you know about medical training, but the GP training post that I had was so well supported. It was really, I was working to a very high level, actually, but the practice I was working was very functional, and I had great support, and I had a great time training with them. But then I moved as a newly qualified GP, and I moved to a more deprived area because I had a health inequalities job lined up, and it was part of my contract that I needed to move surgeries. And so that was a choice that I made. But actually, in retrospect, what I ended up was working in a surgery that was incredibly dysfunctional, where I wasn't supported, and everyone was lovely. Don't get me wrong, the GPs there were fantastic and great people, but everyone was so busy dealing with their own workload and their own stress that there perhaps wasn't that support there that I needed in that transition phase of going from being able to turn to people easily if I needed help to basically being on my own and being fully autonomous. And so that was a tricky transition where perhaps if I'd been in a job that was less stressful, I could have handled it really well. But I was expected to work 10-hour, 12-hour days, seeing up to 50 patients a day in a deprived area where historically there hadn't been great access to GPs. And so there was a lot of need and medical complexity, and not just physical health complexity, but mental health complexity and social complexity as well. And as a GP, quite often I just kind of felt like I wasn't able to give the patients the time that they needed. But also, there's only so much that you can do. I can't fix people's lives, unfortunately, as a GP. I can help with the health aspect of things, but I can't fundamentally change the social issues that people are experiencing. Yeah, and particularly in a resource poor environment. And that really distressed me in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And then what happened was, just gradually, with those things happening, the work stress started to become a lot, but I also had stuff happening outside of work that, yes, the work was a thing that fueled it. However, I also had two young children at the time. I had one in nursery and one that had just started reception, and very young. So they're physically dependent at that age. And as a mum, as a mum, you want to be there to look after your children. Childcare was incredibly inflexible, as you know already, that this is a big problem, and it's ruined
as well.
Yes.
Reception is a huge transition for parents, and hours and time.
And the hours that I was working, I have a partner that works away a lot, and so I was effectively a solo parent. And as you well know, childcare hours going till 6 o'clock in the evening doesn't work with a job that doesn't finish until 8 o'clock. And so not only was I paying for wraparound childcare, I also had a night nanny who would pick my kids up from their childcare, wraparound childcare or nursery, and put them to bed for me. And that didn't make me feel good about myself. And it was also ruinously expensive. I mean, all of my salary went on bills, basically. And then, like a village, I guess, because we don't have family support nearby. And so I very much was dealing with this on my own.
You don't see friends or talk to friends about, you just don't have the time in that, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was, and we don't have family support nearby, so I didn't have the physical help as well as the emotional support. And you mentioned something really interesting, which was about not asking for help. I really felt like I couldn't ask for help. I really felt like this was a problem that I had to fix. And that was partly compounded by what I was getting back at work. Because I remember saying, I'm really finding this difficult. And they were like, well, the other GPs have got kids and they're not finding it hard, so you just have to make it work. And so I was like, oh gosh, this is something that I have to solve myself wholly. And so I took that burden on myself. And I'm not someone that asks for help. I'm someone that copes with my stress myself. But unfortunately, the fact that I didn't ask for help earlier, really, I didn't realize it at the time, but it definitely meant that I ended up then taking on more stress, and then that stress compounded. And so, yes, it was the workplace stress that fueled it, but there were other things that happened outside of the workplace that compounded it. And, when it comes to stress management, we've only got so much capacity. And particularly when you're a mother, there's the intersection of so many things outside of the workplace that compounds that stress, and so you do have less capacity for workplace stress, I think, and it's not your fault.
It's if your child is going through a tough time, that can take all of you. You're
Yeah.
only as happy as your unhappiest child. If so you're going through something at home, it's going
Yeah.
to be like that. We can't segment it all.
And the other thing that was really tricky, looking back at the messages that I sent my husband during that time, was how frequently my youngest was ill.
Oh
It's
God,
literally, you look
yes,
back through
yeah,
the messages, it's literally every month. He's got a fever, he can't go to nursery. Like, what are you supposed to do when you need to be at work?
yeah.
And you've got a partner that works away. And so I was really struggling just with the nature of juggling the work pressures and the kids at that age. And yeah, this is the thing about burnout is, yes, it is fundamentally a workplace problem, but there are people more at risk, and it's particularly parents, caregivers, and women. These are the demographics that are most at risk for the negative effects of workplace stress. And we see this in the literature. It is scientifically proven.
Yeah, and the saddest part is, I can just imagine as a mother, though, it's always this element that people put on you of choice, like, well, you've chosen this, you've chosen to work this, that we carry more than our partners do. And I don't think that at all. But there's so much to unpack there. There's almost like, and also, I really also related to the fact I felt, because I'd got promoted in that 6 months as well when I experienced burnout. And that's when I suddenly didn't have my support anymore, because she was my colleague, not my boss, who'd been great support for me, but didn't have time, and I knew that. And it's that feeling when you're on your own is such a resonant feeling with burnout. What I'd love to know, because when you're in it and you think it's a you problem, you do not know you're going through it. I ended up in a doctor's surgery, and I have no idea where this doctor came from. She was from heaven or something, because she's not been in my doctor's surgery since. I think she was definitely a temp doctor, but I was so nervous that day I took my husband, and I never take my husband to the doctor with me unless it was to do with actual pregnancy. And he was like, so I took him with me, and she was like, you have to take time off. And if you don't take this part time off 2 weeks, you go and think about it in the waiting room and come back. And it was literally like she had to force me to see what I was feeling was not okay, and it had to be fixed. She was like, I write people come in here all the time for doctor's notes. You don't want one, but you have to have one. And so what I'd love to know from your experience and your knowledge, how can someone start to see the signs of burnout themselves? Because it's that self-blame, which I think as mothers, women, we really have, and you said the science proves it. How can we start to see it ourselves?
Yeah, so on that, what I'm going to do is talk you through the stages of burnout because, like you, I didn't realize how much I was in it until I kind of got to that point where I physically could not carry on anymore. And I missed the warning signs of things getting gradually worse. But here's the thing about burnout is that denial and that lack of awareness is actually part of the process of burnout. So it's not your fault that you didn't realize. That is the normal result of the effects of the workplace stress that you were experiencing, how it was affecting your stress hormones and how that was affecting your brain's structure and function. So I didn't know this at the time myself, but it is very much part of that stepwise progression into burnout, and it's part of the features of it. The other thing is there to add is that it's more obvious to people around you before it's obvious to yourself. And so your behavioral changes and your symptoms will be more obvious to people around you, which is why having a support network is so crucial, because they might be able to recognize it before you do. And the other thing to mention is that guilt is also such a fundamental part of the burnout process and the emotions that you experience with it, that some scientists actually argue that it should form part of the definition of it. It doesn't at the moment, but as mothers we experience a lot of guilt already. We feel guilty going to work and leaving our babies, and the experience of guilt in motherhood is so complex, isn't it, and so real as well. And then to have that, with burnout, to have that added guilt of that feelings of failure and self-blame as well, it's really the perfect storm for not recognizing what's happening to you and that self-blame. So let's talk about the 5 stages of burnout and think about the sorts of symptoms that you experience as you slide into burnout and where you can actually intervene to avoid a prolonged recovery period. Because the thing about burnout is it takes 1 to 3 years to recover on average. Some people it's less, some people it's more. And so getting yourself before you end up in full-blown burnout is actually really crucial, because then you can avoid that complex and prolonged recovery period. So burnout starts with the honeymoon period, which is a fairly self-explanatory stage. It's when you're really enjoying your work, you're getting a lot of joy from it, you're really creative, you're full of energy, you're so productive, you're hitting all your deadlines, you feel great.
So that's when you think you've recovered, because for people like us, it's like, yeah, done.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, I'm smashing this out the park. And it's a great thing to experience, right? And we've all experienced that. It's particularly if you started a new job or a new task, task or, what have you. But the danger is if you don't adopt strategies to unwind, if you don't know how to say no, then your boundaries will start to get pushed and you might start taking on a little bit too much, and then you might start to feel stressed. And that's the second stage of burnout. That's the onset of stress. And that's when some days are more stressful than others. But in this particular stage, you might start to notice the onset of some physical symptoms. So you might start to notice you're having a few more headaches, maybe some chest pains, shortness of breath, stomach pains, diarrhea, those sorts of things. The most commonly reported physical symptom actually is muscular aches and pains. In this particular stage of burnout, you might notice that. And then you start to have a few behavioural changes. So with the onset of stress, there comes a lot of blame. You start to blame yourself. You think, oh, what am I doing wrong? And so there are 3 things that you then might start doing as a result of that. The first one is working harder. So overcommitting to your work. So working longer hours, spending more time with your clients, whatever form that takes for yourself. The other thing is withdrawal from friends and families, feeling like your work is the most important thing in the world. So that's the third thing. And so what you start to do is you start to overcommit to work and dedicate yourself more, because what you're trying to do is to make yourself feel less stressed. But actually with the behaviors that you're taking on, you're inadvertently making things harder for yourself. And that's not your fault. It's just what people do when they're stressed. And in this particular stage, you might also notice some psychological symptoms and signs. So difficulty with focus and concentrating in particular might start to arise in this stage of burnout, and also issues with memory. Ironically, I nearly forgot that just now. But yes, I was like, I'm sure there's something else. Yeah, it's memory. So, but also for, if you're pregnant or if you're postnatal, I don't know about you, baby brain is a real thing. And so you might already have some difficulties with that
first
already.
time to deny that as well, because when you've got it can be sometimes really unhelpful if you're surrounded by your elders telling you that's what you've got, and you might be going through something deeper like burnout as well, and it's like, no, fine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the third stage of burnout is chronic stress, and that's where the majority of your days are really stressful. The bad days outnumber the good, basically. And in this stage, all of those symptoms start to get really significant. In particular, in this stage of burnout, you might start to notice this thing called emotional dysregulation. This is one of the key features of burnout, and that's when you can't control your emotions in the way that you used to. So bursting into tears, becoming really angry or irritable or snappy over things that previously you would have kind of just dealt with calmly or taken it in your stride or what have you. And the physical symptoms start to become really significant, as well as the emotional, the mental symptoms. However, you're not in full-blown burnout yet. And this is the point where it will be really obvious to the people around you that you are struggling, but it might not have clicked for you yet. In this stage, some people do turn to alcohol or other substances to try to cope, not necessarily, but people are... Not if you're pregnant, no, obviously. But it might be overeating, or there might be some other substance that you turn to try to get that relief.
I was really addicted to fruit gums. Maybe that was...
yeah, interesting. For me, I can't remember. With my first, I was carbohydrate. It was just carbohydrate that I wanted. I wanted stodge.
That is a great one. It was, fruit gums was a really odd one. But I think it was worse than like a normal pregnancy thing. It was, I get really upset over, but maybe that was pregnancy. You don't know. It's so hard when it's been merged, but
absolutely. And the other symptom that's really very obvious in this stage is fatigue. And obviously, if you're pregnant at the same time, then you're very likely to be fatigued as well, particularly if it's first or third trimester. But the fatigue that you get in burnout is really disproportionate to the amount of sleep that you're getting. And so your symptoms are very significant in this stage. But if you're there, and you're not in full-blown burnout yet, and you've got an opportunity to make significant changes and to avoid that 1 to 3 year recovery period. The next stage is burnout itself, and there are 3 components to burnout that differ from chronic stress. The first one is cynicism and apathy. So you become really detached from your work and your life, and it's really difficult to explain what it feels like if you haven't been through it, because it's this really weird combination of caring too much and feeling really fraught and frazzled, but also not really caring at all. And so you're turning up and going through the motions, feeling everything too intensely, but also not. It's just so weird to explain if you haven't experienced it.
I was reflecting this morning on it, actually, like in preparation for this call, and it's like, oh, isn't it nice to be well again? Because it is that. And I feel sometimes if your support network isn't really strong, they can look at you, and you're also, because I changed because of pregnancy, so there is that. They can look at you like what is wrong with you? And it is, and you don't know either. It's a weird place to be in. Sorry, continue, but it's
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you've been there, you know what it feels like and how difficult it is to explain it to other people. The next component of burnout is reduced performance at work in whatever form that takes. So for me, it was very slow decision making. You know, I used to be very snappy and sharp with my decisions. I was still making the right clinical decisions for my patients, but I really agonized over them. And I was so worried about making a mistake because, you know, my job is really important that I don't make mistakes, and that things that I would normally make very sharp and snappy decisions about, I would ruminate over, and I'd go home and I was never off. I would be like, have I made the right decision with this patient? I guess because I was struggling with my symptoms so much and I kind of knew that there was something wrong, but I just really couldn't afford to make a mistake with my patients at all. And then the other component is emotional exhaustion, which is pretty self-explanatory. So in that particular stage, you know, you have all of those things. The key thing that differentiates it really from the other stages is that cynicism and that apathy that forms part of the definition of burnout. And in this stage, your symptoms are really significant. It affects every aspect of your life. It's not just about your work, it's about your personal life as well. And then the final stage of burnout is habitual burnout. And this is when you need expert help to recover, like basically the changes that you're making are not enough. So in this stage, normally you would need help from a doctor and or a therapist. And the thing about burnout is I don't know if you're aware, it's not actually classed as a medical problem because it's reactive to stress, because it's really the normal endpoint of what your body does when you're exposed to stress. It's not really considered to be a mental health problem or a medical problem in the same way that, say, anxiety or depression is. But the fifth stage of burnout is associated with depression. And if you get there, then you're very likely to be depressed as well. So all of the symptoms that come with that, so lack of motivation, feeling really low, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, eating too much or eating too little, all of the symptoms and the changes that happen with clinical depression are most likely to be found in this stage of burnout as well. And so when I look back at my own slide into burnout, I can see that actually I went through these stages, but at the time I didn't realize it until I was firmly in habitual burnout and I started having panic attacks. And maybe if I'd realized sooner, I could have made changes to prevent myself ending up in that 1 to 3 year recovery period. And so this is part of the reason why I share my journey now and I share what I've learned about burnout, because I feel like if people know about this, then they might have a little bit more awareness about the importance of monitoring their stress levels and how they're behaving and how they're feeling, because then they might have an opportunity to avoid that in the same way that I didn't, you know. So
really seeing it in others. I think raising
yes,
awareness can just help you try, like, be there for others when you're in a good space as well as yourself.
Absolutely.
It is that, like you said, I do think there's that community piece to, because you make yourself isolated in burnout.
Yes,
would you say?
you do.
Like, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And I love the fact, I think for me, I was so worried it would be like, I think obviously this was now like 7 years ago, but like I'd be someone with mental health problems from then on in. I was like really like worried of this label, and I think it was pre-COVID, and it's like now I'm friends with loads of people, and it's like constant journey. Everyone, you start to learn getting older as well. You go through life and you come out the other side, and that's how you build resilience. But what really stands out for me is you talking about the brain changes and why it's 1 to 3 years, because I said, you know, I was still in that 1 to 3 years when I ended up having a significant trauma. So then my brain changed again. And, you know, and obviously it's going to take time, and people don't have time for you to recover. That's what I realised. Like, do you feel that in that recovery piece?
Oh, absolutely. I really felt that. But not only do not other people have the time or the patience for you to recover, the biggest barrier actually was myself not having the time or the patience for myself to recover, because I was like, I've got stuff to do. Like, I've got a really important job, and I've got kids to raise, and a house renovation. I didn't mention that as well. We were renovating our house. By the way, rather tragically, we are still renovating our house, but that's another story.
The house will come when the kids leave home.
Oh, yes, no, that is true. They keep saying to us, when's the loft conversion happening? I'm like, it was meant to have happened by now, and maybe by the time you're 18 it'll happen, who knows. But you know, I it's interesting what you were saying there about you didn't want that label of a mental health problems. That shame, internalized shame, I was so there. I couldn't bring myself at the start of my journey to go to see my own GP and tell them that I needed help, because my GPs, by the way, are lovely. And
no, I but you as well as a doctor.
No,
I know what
as a doctor, I was like, I was like, I cannot go to my GP and sit in front of them and burst into tears and say that I cannot do the job that they are sat in front of me doing. I felt so ashamed. And that's nothing to do with them, because my GP surgery have always been incredibly kind and helpful when I've ever needed them. That was all on me. That was me blaming myself and really not understanding why I couldn't get over it. I genuinely thought that there was something wrong with me. Like, there was obviously something wrong with me, but I that recovery, I was like, why am I not getting better quicker? What is wrong with me? Why am I not smashing this out of the park? And I just didn't understand the complexity of the changes that happen to your brain and body in burnout and why it takes so long. It's because your brain has changed structure and function. Now, I realise that for anyone that's listening to this who's there at the moment, that can feel like a very intimidating thing to hear. But actually, I found it liberating and empowering when I found that out, because I was like, it's not me. This is just the process. And learning to be compassionate to myself and to have realistic expectations about the recovery, and having a graded recovery as well, kind of gradually increasing what I can do and take on. It was a real humbling lesson to learn those skills and to learn to be more compassionate towards myself. It was a really crucial discovery for me to learn that actually it does take that amount of time to get better. And I had to learn different ways of living and working in order to get better. The other thing about the changes that happen to the brain in burnout, which is really important to say, is they are temporary. So as you recover, as your stress levels go back to normal, yes, it takes time, but those brain changes and those hormonal changes, they do go back to baseline. And so they're not permanent, they are not forever. And so you mentioned there that you were worried about having that label. It doesn't have to be a label that you carry with you for the rest of your life. What I found with my own recovery is that it's always in the back of my mind now, and I'm very much aware to monitor myself and my stress levels. But the biggest change I've made is to make sure that I'm just regularly checking in with myself and making sure that the decisions I'm making about my career and how I work and live my life respect what has happened to me previously, because I don't want to go back to that place. I'm highly motivated to not go back to that place, but just checking in on myself regularly and actively monitoring my stress levels has been a very key change in that recovery process for me.
I completely agree and so relate to that. And I think what you say about the timeline as well, because when I had the trauma, I kept being told PTSD, you'll know if you have PTSD within the first 12 weeks. And so when it got to the 12-week mark and I had a huge amount of issues during those times, to the point even speaking to someone on a Friday night, and it was bad, but I kept being, I've made it to 12 weeks, so I'm fine. And then when I was at 6 months and things were really bad, it was like, well, no, I would have been told by now. But it's those, and then I researched it, and that's a load of rubbish.
Yeah, do you know, I was just, when you said 12 weeks, I was like, who told you that? Because that's not the very definition of PTSD. Is it happens after the trauma. It is weeks, months, years down the line that the symptoms arise. So that's rubbish.
And especially if you're pregnant and looking after babies, because that's something I'd like to really talk about, is those early years. And actually something you hit on is you were so frustrated because you were a mother, you had these young children to look after, and that was something I was really hard on myself, because you also get told this narrative that how key the early years is for your little ones. And when you're going through something, which a lot of us are, like I speak to so many women on this podcast who have birth trauma or job loss and real events, or COVID, a lot of them have gone through pregnancy or the early years. And I don't know about you, I was so hard on myself that my little ones had a mum who was all over the place for a few years, kind of thing, to the point where me and my husband are like, our kids must feel like so much better now because our house we're fine again, and we know how to check in with ourselves to keep making sure we're fine, even when we've been through things like we lost my mother-in-law earlier this year, but it's not been as bad in our house as it was those years, because we've learned how to look after ourselves.
I mean, I think there's so much to unpick here, isn't it? When I look back at that time period, I was not a good mother, objectively and subjectively, I think. And I feel so guilty and so awful about that time period. In fact, I'm actually welling up now because I feel so awful. No. It's fine. It's so real, isn't it? That you have your kids, and that pressure to be the best mother isn't just your own, as you said, your own internal pressure. It's also the expectations of society and social media in particular, I think, because there is so much much online advice about how you should be parenting, and a lot of it is moral driven, I find anyway. So there's so much pressure, and I have to, my kids are a lot older now. My oldest is about to turn 12, but to be honest with you, she doesn't really remember that time period. My youngest absolutely doesn't. And so they actually, both of them are turning out to be very well adjusted. They're happy kids. Obviously they have their challenges, especially as they get older. The emotional challenges become a little bit harder.
It's
yeah. The problems change, and they get bigger in some respects, but they're both handling those challenges really well. Really pleased that what I went through doesn't appear to have had a permanent effect on them, and our family life is so much happier as a result. So I kind of feel like hopefully they haven't had any negative effects from that period. But for me also, it was because of my training, and because in my training I've done a lot of paediatric work, and one of my placements actually as a trainee GP was in community paediatrics, where we see a lot of children who have very chaotic and disruptive childhoods, who end up, with attachment disorders as a result of dysfunctional family relationships, and those children carry those issues throughout the entirety of their life. So I was informed about attachment issues, and I really worried about the fact that might have affected. Do you know what I mean? Because I had that professional knowledge.
I had the same with my first child. I didn't have a professional brain because I in the trauma left them, like mentally left them. Not my second child, because he was just on me the entire time. He was just a nicky baby. He just wanted to be carried. So he was attached to me the whole time. But the other one, I was like, oh God, I've broken him. I genuinely thought that at one point. I was like,
bless you.
And he was actually just going through the toddler years as well. He was just being a toddler. But at the same time now, when I see friends toddlers who aren't going through that, but it is important to talk. You're brilliant and amazing, and I know everyone, you've gone through something and you're a fantastic mother, but you have these worries, don't you? It's when we talk about this.
Absolutely. And I think the thing to say about, if you're going through a difficult time, is that your children, it's not all on you. Is what I wanted to say is, it's important that your children, especially in those early years, so we're talking 18 months or less, is that they are attached to a primary caregiver. And from a scientific point of view, it doesn't matter who that person is. It doesn't matter if it's you as the mother. We feel like it should be ourselves because that's what the expectation that we put on ourselves. But it can be dad. It can be grandma. It can be the paid help. It doesn't, if you're privileged enough to have a nanny, as long as they form a solid attachment to a person in those early years, then they're set up. Then as they get older, they can form those attachments. They can choose to form those attachments with other people and form secure attachments. So if it's not you, for some reason in those early years, as long as they've got that one person, it doesn't matter. So from an attachment theory perspective, that's the most important thing. But the other thing to add to that actually is, in terms of what your children need from an emotional perspective, it's not that much. It's really, even when I was going through my burnout, and I'm sure even when you were going through your difficult times with your first and with your second, you were meeting their physical and their emotional needs. Children need very little actually to form secure attachments. You just need to be, it's true. You basically, you go to it when it cries, and you meet its physical needs, and you give it cuddles. It's really not that hard.
My second, he was just attached to me, so he was fine. It was always the first. I was like, oh God, I'm so not here mentally, and he can see it,
Yeah, but you clearly were, though, so the bar is low, I think is what I'm trying to say. Actually, we build up in our heads that we have to be all of these things to our children. We have to constantly be there to be emotionally and physically available, and actually what they need is not as much as you think.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I know that's so tough to talk about when it's yourself, especially as a doctor, especially as a mother. It's the hardest thing to think, I felt all of these things, and you've been so generous there. We talk about your recovery, it's slow, the 1 to 3 years. Were there any significant milestones for you where you were like, oh my God, I can't feel this again?
Yeah.
Okay, I've had a blip. I've had Anna Martha on the podcast once, and we're talking about stepping back. Step backs can feel awful in the beginning, and then you start to learn, actually, no, I'm feeling like this today because I'm going to feel even better to when I got through this period. For you, were there any milestones?
Yeah, so those setbacks, I mean, it took me a long time. Yeah, because the thing about recovery is it's not linear. So
Yeah.
you will go through periods where you feel like everything is going really well, and then you go backwards. And it's really difficult to not panic when you feel like you're having a difficult day or you feel like you're going backwards because you're like, I don't want to go back to where I was.
Mhm.
As long as the overall trajectory is moving in the right direction, that's the most important thing. So learning those skills of self-compassion and being kind to yourself is really important in those early days. So therapy, you need therapy basically to help you learn those skills, I would say. Like without therapy, I would not have been able to deal with that.
Same.
But in terms, yeah,
EMDR, yeah, that was my therapy of choice.
yes,
And
yeah,
actually, it's
yeah.
excellent.
Yeah, for PTSD, it is the best type of therapy to have. In burnout, CBT and acceptance and commitment therapy are also really helpful.
Acceptance and commitment therapy, I feel because
Mm,
CBT I struggled with, and I think it was the
yes,
workload that I was given with CBT was my issue, because as
yeah.
being a highly functioning person, you want to check it off the list, and
Yeah, yeah,
that's,
I feel
I was
that.
too
Yeah,
busy doing that rather than
yeah.
realizing what was happening to me.
Yeah, I mean CBT is not for everyone,
Mm.
but yeah, acceptance and commitment therapy is a it's almost like counterintuitive to CBT because CBT gets you to challenge your thoughts and to reframe them and to write new ones. Acceptance and commitment therapy doesn't do that. It gets you to accept what you're experiencing, but then still to go out and do what matters and live the life that you want to live. And so they kind of come at it from different angles, and it's actually a really powerful thing to do in burnout. And I think especially for mums where there's a lot that you cannot control and you might not have the time or the energy to engage with the work that CBT involves. But coming back to your original question about milestones, so looking back, there were a number of milestones that I felt at the time. Everyone's milestones look different, but for me, the first one was just having the energy to look after myself again. Booking all of my appointments that I'd missed for 2 years. You know, my opticians were withholding my contact lenses because I hadn't had an eye test for like 3 years or something stupid. So I'd just been ignoring all the reminders. I hadn't been to the dentist. You know, I wasn't like washing my face or brushing my teeth, and just having the energy to do those really basic things. In the early days, I needed my husband to tell me to do it. He was the one that kept me accountable, and I was really mean to him, actually. I was like, don't tell me what to do, and oh, you're always on at me. Because I was in such a
There's a
negative,
child's relationship coming in
yeah,
there
yeah,
at that
I was in such a negative mindset, but for me that was a big milestone. The next one was when I remember, and I remember this so clearly, and this is probably my biggest milestone. I was very depressed for several months and I didn't enjoy anything, like literally nothing. Every day was a slog. And I was out with my kids. I don't even remember what we were doing, probably just going to the park. It was really mundane. It was nothing significant. And I just had a moment where I realized I was really enjoying myself. And I just, because I hadn't experienced that for so long, I'd just very much been going through the motions. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, oh, this is how I'm meant to be feeling. And it was like, oh, for a moment, the weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And then I got really upset because I was like, oh, now I realise on what I've been missing out on for so long. But I think, yeah, and I got very overwhelmed and angry that my burnout was robbing me of enjoyment with my family. But I was also very grateful knowing that I could experience that again. And that for me was a big milestone. For me, when I started to have more good days than bad, that was a big relief, a big moment for me. Going back to work and managing my work stress was really important. I remember I ended up eventually I took 9 months off of NHS work. I still worked as a private GP, so I did some digital work, some online consulting, which wasn't stressful in the same way. Took 9 months off of NHS work to get better, so I had the help of a doctor and a therapist through NHS Practitioner Health, which is the health service for doctors who have mental health problems, and they were just an absolute godsend. And we agreed that actually I shouldn't be doing NHS work whilst I was going through this programme. When I went back, the day that I went back, looking back, probably because I was working as a locum, it probably was not the best. I went back on a bank holiday weekend, which is not, in retrospect, the best or the most clever decision. But basically, I walked into a dumpster truck fire of overwhelming patient demand. I don't know what was going on. And I just I remember walking in and looking at the screen and just going, how is this going to be safe? How am I going to manage this? How am I going to call all these patients? How am I going to keep people safe? And what I did was I took myself off to the coffee room, got myself a cup of tea, and spent 5 minutes doing the techniques I'd learned in therapy, calmed myself down. You know, I was having palpitations, and I was like, okay, calmed myself down. I was like, I can do this. Let's just go back and just take it one patient at a time. And actually, do you know what? The shift was fine. It was absolutely not, yeah, we got through it. The patients were fine. I was fine. And that actually was really nice for me because I realised that I could still go and do the job and I could handle that overwhelming sense of panic and still do a really good job and then finish it and think, actually, that wasn't too bad. So that was a really big milestone for
That's
me.
huge.
Mm,
Talking about your feelings of
yeah.
joy and the anger of getting robbed of that. I think then sometimes something I started to reframe was like, you can't really feel true joy until you've realized you've really felt the other feelings and not ignored them. Do you think there's something in that
Mm,
as well? Was something that I started to feel like was that if you're robbing yourself of really understanding that you felt awful and that was your feeling, then you can really understand feeling joy again.
So I think for me, the biggest transformation came through having therapy. And I
Mm.
think it was having therapy that allowed me to then have that realization that you were kind of explaining there, and allowed me to not only develop coping strategies for managing stress in the moment, as I described for that return to work,
Yeah.
but it also allowed me coping strategies to manage those thoughts and feelings and emotions and that more long-term stuff of that recovery journey. Because the thing is, when you're making changes at work or dealing with stress at work, you're not going to be fully recovered. And so that's challenging. And so having those techniques and being supported to recover with my therapist allowed me to kind of have those realizations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
definitely. Because I had the same, and it would be more around because I was around two little kids, I would put things like she taught me how to do things, with the senses and even just putting water on my wrist when I was getting to those toes. I was like all
Uh,
those things because it's more around the kids I would feel that stress because you kind of, they're little ones and they're going, you're meeting them on that level. So
yeah.
it's amazing going to therapy and realize and
Mm,
learning all these tools and learning it's not you and
yeah.
your brain is going through that. And it brings me around to something is that you talk about 9 risk factors for burnout, but you also talk about neurodiversity, and I think this is such an
Mm,
important topic because I know a lot of female founders are learning about their neurodiversity and things like that, and you're at greater risk if if you are ADHD. And how can we better support, why is that, and how can we better support the neurodivergent women in leadership and motherhood? Because I think this is such an important topic to delve into.
absolutely. So the thing about ADHD is that you're more likely to have rapid cycles of burnout that are workplace stress is a factor without a doubt because being neurodivergent in a neurotypical workplace comes with a whole heap of stress and difficulties. But in ADHD and autistic spectrum disorders are the other type of neurodiversity where people can experience rapid cycles of burnout, is that those burnout cycles are largely fueled by your underlying condition, whether that's ADHD or ASD. And so it's not just about workplace stress, it's also about all the stuff that's happening outside of the workplace as well. The thing about ADHD in women is it is slightly more complicated, particularly when it comes to the discussion about work and burnout, and being a mother as well, because women with ADHD are more likely to burn out than men with ADHD because there is because there's a complex interplay of factors. First of all, you've got the ADHD in itself and how it affects women. It affects women in a different way to men. Women present with different symptoms. Women are more likely to mask. So women tend to adapt to their ADHD in ways that then inadvertently fuel burnout. So it's those things like perfectionism, people pleasing, imposter syndrome, hyperfixating on things and wanting to be the perfect employee and the perfect mother and becoming fixated on that, followed by cycles of feeling completely overwhelmed where you're incapacitated and not productive at all. And then you feel really guilty that you're not doing what you feel like you should be doing in the workplace and with your kids, and then the cycle just starts again. And women are more likely to do that. Women with ADHD are more likely to do that than men with ADHD. And also, there's a whole raft of women who are late diagnosed because of masking, because women don't present in the same way that men do, and with late diagnosis comes, I think, by the time you get diagnosed, if you go down that route, because not everyone who suspects that they're ADHD will go down the path of getting a diagnosis, because it takes years on the NHS, unfortunately. The waiting lists are crazy. There's a whole lot to unpack by the time that you get there from, an emotional perspective, because you've probably got to a point where you feel really a lot of shame about the fact that about the problems that you're experiencing in the workplace and at home, and unpacking that is quite tricky.
Yeah.
And the other thing to say about ADHD is that traditional support methods and therapies don't necessarily work in ADHD. So we mentioned CBT and how you found the work around that tricky and time consuming and cumbersome. ADHD, quite often CBT, even though it's evidence-based actually, to help reduce burnout in ADHD in women, sometimes people find it very confronting and they just find it really difficult to engage with. DBT, on the other hand, and acceptance and commitment therapy is it's easier in some respects for people with ADHD to engage with that. So you really need to think, so you really need to think about, the conventional ways of supporting neurotypical people don't necessarily work the same for people who are neurodivergent. And so it's all about managing the effects of your neurodivergence in a way that optimizes you to break those burnout cycles, right? So it might be a combination of medical support. So for some people, getting a diagnosis is a total game changer. Being on medication for ADHD can really help people to manage the effects of their neurodivergence in a neurotypical workplace. Therapeutic support and coaching, obviously if you have got ADHD, then it does open up doors in terms of the Access to Work scheme. You can get help through this government funded scheme to have ADHD coping or adjustments made in the workplace, and changes at work as well, in terms of how your symptoms affect you at work and getting those changes from your employer. But let's not forget that not everyone has an employer that is supportive of neurodivergence, and the amount of support that you can get and the changes that you can get will vary depending on where you're working and how you're working. And for your audience as well, largely being entrepreneurs, a lot of entrepreneurs do have ADHD because because they are, and don't forget, a lot of these women are really successful. They're high flying because their ADHD can be a superpower, but it can also lead to these rapid cycles of burnout. And particularly when you're an entrepreneur, where you're the one running the ship and the responsibility lies on you for building that business and getting it out there and getting results, it can fuel some of those ADHD behaviors, and it means that you are more likely to end up in burnout, unfortunately. So yeah, it's a really interesting issue that I think has only really come to the forefront over the last sort of few years, I would say, as there has been a growing awareness around neurodivergence in the workplace. But yes, it's definitely something that affects women in a different way to men, I would say.
It's so interesting. And on the entrepreneur part as well, what would you say? There'll be so many founders listening to this and be like, yeah, this is great. I can't, while I'm in burnout, or they're recognizing the signs, but I cannot stop my business, or I stop earning, I stop bringing in money to the home. And also, you're very clear in your book, you don't have to quit or give up your ambition, which was a huge mind. I think that was also something I was terrified of. It's like, if I can't work like this means I can't be an ambitious woman, which is ridiculous, because I just was in a wrong environment and had so many other factors at play, clearly, as we've discussed. But what can a realistic recovery look like if you can't stop, and you also can't stop being a mother? So I think we can all relate to that as well.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I go into a lot of detail in the book, because it's a complex, recovery is complex and it takes a long time. But in terms of the changes that you need to make, really there are three key things to focus on. And again, I feel like maybe I over-labored this in the book, but it's really important, because the changes that you need to make are not necessarily big sweeping changes to how you live and to how you work. You don't need to quit your job. Most people do work through their burnout and they still get better, but you do need to make changes to the work factors that are causing your stress, and also how you cope with your stress as well. So the things that in the scientific literature that make a difference and predict a successful recovery are, first of all, believing that you are in control of your work, or having that control over your work. There are different ways that you can achieve this. And it very much depends on the work that you do and how much control you have over it. So for me, I obviously couldn't control having to see up to 50 patients a day and a lot of the problems around the lack of budget and resource in the NHS. But what I could control is leaving that job and locuming. So I then controlled how I worked, when I worked, how much money I was paid, and where I did that work as well. And that was really key for me to have that form of control and autonomy. Still doing the same job, just in a different way. And so that was a change that I made. And for different people, getting that control over your work will be different for different people, you know. But it doesn't mean that you have to leave your job. It's about whether or not you can get that control in the job that you're currently in. The second thing, which is related to that, is believing that you have control over your well-being. And I would say that therapy there is a game changer, learning those techniques to manage your stress and having coping strategies in the bank that aren't like your typical wellness advice, because the thing about all the advice that's available on the internet and the things that you believe that are good for you, like for instance going and exercising, eating well, those things are all great for your physical and mental health. But when it comes to burnout, actually those things are the icing on the cake. Those are the things that you do to maintain your mental well-being. It's not about recovery. And so it's really about learning those strategies to manage your stress and changing how you deal with your risk factors for burnout, like imposter syndrome, people pleasing, previous trauma, current trauma, neurodivergence, all of those things that you need to learn proper therapeutic strategies so that you can get that control over your well-being. And then the final thing is having a supportive community and a network. And I don't think that this necessarily has to be in the workplace. That might be helpful. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a community where you can talk about your workplace stress or the things that are stressing you out. It just has to be a place where you feel safe, where you can share whatever is happening without fear of repercussion. And it doesn't matter really, I think, where you get that from, whether it's from your family, whether it's from your friends, whether it's from a group of mums, whether it's online or offline, just as long as you've got somewhere safe to offload and know that you're not going to have any repercussions, that's really, really essential for your recovery. So those are the things to really focus on in terms of getting a successful recovery. But I would say, especially for mums, there are some things that you need to think about specifically to allow you to recover and to recover well, because you mentioned you can't leave your kids, and you love your kids and you had your kids for a reason, you know, and you want to be the best mum that you can be for those kids. So what is it specifically for mums that makes a difference? Number one, boundaries. Like, you have to have boundaries professionally so that you don't take on too much. If you're an entrepreneur, this is really difficult because you feel that pressure. But let me tell you, you will be more productive and you will be more successful if you carve out time for yourself, time with your kids and time off of your business. If you stop work at 6 o'clock in the evening and you allow yourself an evening off, that's not going to be the thing that means your business is a success or a failure. But coming back to the boundaries point, is you just make it clear who, you know, with your work and who you're working with, that you're not available at certain times, right? And as long as you're making it clear, then people know that. And it's not going to be the thing that makes a difference. And you will be a happier and more productive business owner, and you'll be much more efficient if you have downtime. So using your rest and recovery time is really, really important. And on that note, as a mum, having time for yourself in whatever form that means. And that's really difficult. So carving that time out as a mum, you just feel so guilty. But, you know, when I look at my burnout time, like, I was either working or I was with my kids, and I didn't really do anything for myself. So I now carve out that time. And even if it's just an hour a week, ring fence that time and get support to allow you to do that. So ask your partner to take the kids out for an hour, or put them into after school club just so that you can go and do something else. And don't feel guilty about it as well. And that also leads quite nicely onto the asking for help thing, because I think for mums it's really difficult to ask for help. But yeah, learning to ask for help is so important. And that can be as simple as, if your kids are if they're older, asking them to help you around the house, asking your partner to help, asking your family to help, asking your friends to help. And if you've got the financial means, paying for help. Can you get a cleaner? Can you pay for some additional childcare? Whatever it is. Obviously, that's not accessible to everyone, but there are other ways of getting help, or, you know, having a reciprocal arrangement with someone, you know, that can also be an option. So I think those really are the key things for mums when it comes to recovery. But I think when it comes to the way that you work as well, I think just sometimes realizing that you can still be ambitious, but there might just be a short period in your life where actually your ambition gets put on the back burner temporarily, and that's okay. That's okay. You're still the same person that you were in your early 20s, your late 20s, before you had kids, and you can still come back to that ambition. But sometimes it's okay just to place it on hold temporarily and just look after yourself and do what needs to be done to survive, you know, and that's okay. It's okay to
That
do
and
that.
that's such a good point, because you can do that in business. I got to a point in my business where I brought in the income that I needed to, and I say, "Oh, business slowed down," and you can literally see it. And I always have to, I was on a business program recently where I had to say why, and I was like, I was in therapy every week, and I had to work on myself, and then it means
Yeah.
I can now go again in a much better, sustainable way and do better, and it's easier because I looked after myself for those years, and it is a privilege, but there are times, if we're talking about ambitious people here, you've got to
Oh
withdraw
yeah.
a bit in order to do the best, especially if you're running. I run a people business, so therefore I know, like mothers, you can only be the best for others if you are the best in yourself. Otherwise
Mm.
it's not going to work out very well for the people around you. And those are such fantastic tips there, and I really liked the control one as well, because basically for a job, technically what I do isn't too much difference from what I did when I had burnout, but it's my
Mhm.
culture. Now
Exactly.
it's my business. I'm away from the
Yeah.
toxic environment that was created by people that didn't understand what this environment they had created had led to everyone in the business. Because my story isn't alone from that business. I know that
Mm.
for a fact now. I'm out of it and talk to others
Yeah.
from it. And I think that's a really important point to highlight, that your ambition, just you could be in a really bad environment, and or like I said, and sadly the NHS, like there's so many constraints with that. And I know,
Yeah.
speak teachers as well, like the
Yes.
environments as well,
Yeah.
similar environments you're going through. And I think some people can look at, if you're an entrepreneur, a safe, secure job, like they don't have these issues. And sometimes it's like it could be like, no, that's they have it's completely different issues, but it can cause the same issues as burnout as being a founder, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing that. You've shared so openly your journey, but also real tools, strategies, as well as really raising awareness of what happens when you're in burnout. And it's not just a buzzword that you see on TikTok. That is like, it's a real issue, and it changes your brain, and it's something that needs to be really recognized in order to help support people. Because like you said, the key there is therapy, and that's needed for so many people to kind of understand how to not get to that place again, and to
Mm.
begin that recovery process, which can take a time, but it's worth it
Mhm.
from two people on the other side of it, isn't it?
Mm. And actually, that's a really nice way to kind of start to tie things up, isn't it? Is that recovery is possible and there's hope. I think when you're in the thick of it, it's really difficult to feel hopeful and optimistic about the future. But absolutely, you can come out the other side. And, I'm sure this is the same for you, but my life and my career now is going to look very different to how I imagined it. I had to go through a period of grieving it, actually, and grieving the loss of what I thought I was going to have. But I'm now actually at a point where I'm really glad that what happened, because I've made significant changes and I know that what I'm building now is going to be far more sustainable and something that really works for me and my family. And I can't ask for more than that.
And your children get to see it. I think it's so important now.
Hmm.
It's not like when we grew up and you had to hide all of that. It's like we can
Yeah.
really share like the messy journey we've been through with our careers. So if one of your
Mm.
kids wants to go be a doctor and it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world, because their mother's been through that journey, kind of thing, or anything else.
I mean, funnily enough, neither of them want to be doctors.
Yes, like I said, my husband's parents were doctors, my mum's the nurse, and neither of us are
Yeah.
in the medical field.
Yeah, but to be honest with you, they can do whatever I will support them to do whatever it is that they want to do. I think it is really, I think role modeling is so important, and I'm very open and honest actually with, and obviously age appropriate, but I talk to them about the challenges that I've experienced and in an age appropriate and accessible way for them. And they really, and they get it. They just accept things for what they are, and they're like, okay, fine, all right. But it is interesting how this generation, like we are having those conversations. We're talking about mental health with kids, and I'm giving my kids skills to build resilience, and it's just I didn't have that myself. I'm not
Yeah.
blaming my parents. It was just a different time, and those things were not talked about. Those skills were not taught. I really feel now like I hopefully this younger generation that are coming up now, that they will have those skills embedded from a young age. Fingers crossed. Anyway, when my kids go to therapy, it won't be because I haven't taught them, I haven't loved them enough, I haven't,
Therapy anyway, so minimize. So it won't be a
Exactly.
surprise for them, maybe.
Absolutely.
I like to end on, because this is so poignant. It was last year, like you talk about your own milestones there, so it's
Mhm.
made me reflect on mine. It was last year I kind of really realized that joy piece, and that how much I'd been missing that since
Yeah.
the burnout and everything that happened, was that really true, like just going to the theatre and being really engrossed in that joy. That's my joy. Or being in a dance class and really feel like I'm pushing myself like I used to as a teenager, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
what does joy look like for you on the other side of burnout, and something
Mm.
just for Claire?
Yeah, I absolutely love this question, particularly because, burnout, there's such a joyless thing to go through, and, you kind of worry that you'll never experience it again, but you do get there, as you said. So for me, there are things to do with work, around autonomy and freedom of choice and what have you. But outside of that, it's spending time with my children, and we love to get outside. We're a very outdoorsy, active family. We like to go for, spend time on the coast, go for bike rides, all of that sort of stuff. And so I really enjoy doing that with my family, with my husband, and with my kids. I also really enjoy doing my hobbies and doing things just for me. So I now go to the gym regularly, and I'm currently doing some like lifting and some high rocks training, and I'm really enjoying that because I'm seeing myself progress, but I'm not being competitive over it. I'm normally very competitive with myself, learned that behavior. So I'm really enjoying that. And also I have learned to sew. So I like to sew clothes for myself. I made this top that I'm wearing
So
today.
creative.
And so yeah, getting creative I'm getting a lot of joy from that because it's learning a new skill. It is, and especially sewing as well, like you do get into flow state, which is really important in burnout recovery as well. And then you get to make something. I mean, I've made a lot of mistakes, don't get me wrong. Like a lot of my projects end up not working out. They've ended up in the bin. So it doesn't always work out, but when it does, like you have the process is joyful, hopefully. But then the outcome is joyful as well. So I'm really enjoying that.
I love that, because you've mentioned so many things there about getting outside, lifting, so important
Yep.
for women. I'm starting to
Yes.
realise this week, especially as we get older, and creativity, getting into
Mm.
flow. And I think that's so important. And I'm thinking I do have a cross stitch that's just been sat there waiting for a year, which I will
Mhm.
pick up at some point. But
Yeah.
those things, I've picked up novels recently, so I'm like, well, actually, I'm reading for joy instead. So we'll do that. And it's
Yes.
all these things that are so important to get your brain to switch off, and because I
Yeah.
think reading a novel does, and sewing does. And so I love that. And again, it's that optimism beyond burnout, because I think it's so important. I would have
Mhm.
loved to listen to a podcast where it's like, okay, you're in the thick of it, this is what it
Yeah.
looks like, but there is another side once you've gone through the process, kind of thing. So
Mm.
Claire, thank you. Where can people find your book? Because your book is amazing and brilliant. And where can people find out more about you?
Thank you. So my book is The Burnout Doctor, and it's available from all good bookstores and Amazon. On socials, you can find me at Dr Claire Ashely.
Well, thank you again, Claire.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to Bump to Business Owner. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please do rate, review, follow, or subscribe wherever you're listening. It really helps us to connect with more mums and business owners. You can DM me on @BumpToBusinessOwner on Instagram, and I'll be back next week.